Um, welcome everyone to this NERI seminar. My name is Paul McFlynn, co-director of the NERI, and we are delighted to have Michael Vallely here with us today to present his paper, "Do Cultural Capital and Social Capital Explain the Social Origin Pay Gap?" Michael is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Economic and Social Research Institute down in Dublin, and has, in addition to academic positions, also worked previously in the Scottish Government. But Michael presented some at our labour market conference as well in May of this year, and I was particularly taken by the subject area because I think social origins and social class is an incredibly important research topic that has not gotten the I think the interest that it has deserved over recent years, and I think the presentation we're going to see today, I think, presents this research in a very accessible and a very interesting way. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael, and he's going to go through his presentation. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have enough time for some questions. If people want to put them into the chat function, we can then go through them at the end of the presentation. But I will hand over to Michael now.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'll just share my slides here. Just to confirm everyone can see them okay? Everyone see my slides okay, yes?
Yeah, they're good, Michael.
Okay, perfect, Paul. So hello everyone. Firstly, I just want to say a thanks to Paul and NERI for the opportunity to present here today. As Paul was saying, I presented back in May at the Labour Market Conference, and it's great to get the opportunity to present here again this work. As Paul was saying, I'm a postdoc at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin, but as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from Dublin, I'm from Glasgow. And I'm aware that a Glaswegian accent is probably one of the most difficult ones to understand. So at any point, if people can't quite make out what I'm saying, please feel free to let me know, and I'll either do my best to slow it down, or maybe we'll see about getting some subtitles on the screen. But whilst I'm half joking about my accent, it brings me on what I'm going to speak about today, which is cultural capital, and more specifically, the role that cultural capital and social capital can potentially play in explaining the social origin pay gap. So the motivation for this study is that it's been well established across various disciplines that the family you're born into matters for your life outcomes. So within the UK, we see that higher education is disproportionately made up of those from more middle-class origins, particularly within the Russell Group universities. And we see that individuals from more working-class backgrounds are significantly less likely to obtain the grades to get into university in the first place. And in terms of the labour market, we see strong signs of class reproduction. So for instance, there was one study that found if one of your parents was a lawyer, you were 17 times more likely to become a lawyer yourself. And if one of your parents was a doctor, you were 24 times more likely to become a doctor yourself. So across these professions, such as medicine, law, finance, accounts, journalism, just to name a few, these by and large do not reflect the diversity of the population. So the policy consensus to address these issues is often that we should aim to improve the educational attainment of those from more quote-unquote disadvantaged backgrounds, and this will in turn solve occupational mobility and income inequality. However, within the past 10 years or so, there has been a new branch of evidence which has found an unexplained social origin pay gap, and this has been found in a range of high-income countries, including the UK, the US, Norway, and Sweden. But my research focuses on the UK. So in this slide here, I just present some of the main studies which have found an unexplained social origin pay gap in UK data sets. So for instance, Crawford and Vignals, they used schooling type as a proxy for social origin and found a pay gap of around 6%. Crawford and Van de Veer used the British cohort study, and they used parental education as a proxy for social origin. They found a pay gap of around 8%. Jack Britton and his colleagues use family income as a proxy for social origin and find a pay gap of around 10%. And then Lawrison and Friedman have published a few papers using the labour force survey, and they found a pay gap of around £2,200 per annum. So this is individuals from working class origins, even when they do hold degrees and they do work in the same types of jobs as their upper class counterparts, they're still receiving less pay. So the research highlights that across a range of different UK data sets and using a range of different proxies, there's still the same thing is being found, an unexplained social origin pay gap. So the research highlights that strictly human capital factors are not fully explaining these pay variances. And the two main things which appear to be explaining this within the qualitative literature are cultural capital and social capital. So cultural capital is a phrase that was coined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and it looks at different forms of cultural capital, which include institutionalized cultural capital, which is our education, objectified cultural capital, which is our interests and activities that we engage in, and then we've got embodied cultural capital, which looks at accent, mannerisms, speech, linguistics, etc. And a lot of the social origin pay gap literature is focused on professional and managerial occupations, where largely the culture of these firms replicate those from more upper class upbringings. So we see, excuse me, a lot of firms or occupations like law, finance, accounts, etc. A lot of these are very much client focused. And we can see that the role cultural capital plays in this, where individuals within the hiring and recruitment process, if they display these forms of capital, are seen as more desirable and is seen as a better fit within these professions. And another aspect of which appears to be explaining the unexplained pay gap is also social capital. And a lot of the qualitative literature, again on the hiring and recruitment process, shows that a lot of these networks and connections are formed before the workplace. So they're formed based on the type of private school that individuals attended, maybe an elite university, but also private connections, as in, you know, their fathers knew someone in the firm, their mother knew someone, etc. And this all plays a role in getting individuals essentially their foot in the door, or also getting them an internship or securing a job. So the contribution or the question of this paper is therefore, to what extent does cultural capital and social capital explain the social origin pay gap? So as I say, there's a number of qualitative studies which has looked at the hiring and recruitment process, promotion processes, etc., and they're looking at the role of cultural capital and social capital, but there hasn't been a study which has yet quantitatively tested this. Now, that's the contribution of the paper, but I'm not arguing or suggesting by any means that quantitatively testing this is more valuable or more important than the qualitative research which previously exists. It's just that that is the contribution, and that there's a gap there that hasn't been done before with a large-scale secondary data set, and this is the gap I aim to contribute to in the literature with this paper. So the data set that I use is Understanding Society, which is also known as UK Household Longitudinal Study, and this follows, approximately 100,000 individuals across 40,000 households over time. So in this paper, I use data from waves 1 to 9, which covers the calendar years 2009 to 2019. And I make a few restrictions on the sample, as we're looking at individuals who are earning a wage income. So we're not looking at the self-employed. That's not to say that the self-employed are affected by different channels, which aren't related to their class. But we're looking at wage income as we want to see how an individual's social origin potentially affects the level of pay they receive in the workplace. So we're looking at wage income, and we're not looking at other forms of income such as dividends, stocks, etc. I'm using the ONS working age population, so those from 16 to 64, and of course we're limiting it to those who report social origin and those who report social information on cultural capital and social capital. So as I said previously, there's a number of different proxies that can be used for social origin. All have their advantages and limitations, but here I use parental occupation as a proxy for social origin. So this rests on the theoretical argument from the discipline of sociology that individuals who work in the same types of jobs can be classified and viewed and identified as a particular social class. Based on them working in the same types of jobs, they share the same living, material, social and economic conditions, which can also be used as their occupation as proxies for education and income as well. So more specifically, the question that's asked is what was the higher occupational status of the respondents' parents when they were age 14? But as I says, all of these proxies, they do have the limitations to an extent. Limitations to this approach is that sometimes based on these surveys, the information is derived from a series of questions, which previously I looked at in one of my other thesis chapters. And of course, the labour market is changing over time. So the occupational frameworks or these classifications, they might not necessarily capture the, let's say, the economic and social reality of a respondent during their upbringing, given that we're asking questions, related to potentially 30, 40 years ago based on their mother or father's occupation. So individuals in the survey are asked, what was the higher of your mother and father's occupation when you were age 14? So if an individual, let's say their mother was a lawyer and their father was a teacher, that individual would be from NSEC 1 origins because the mother's occupation is higher than the father's. So NSEC 1, some examples include lawyers, doctors, engineers, accountants. NSEC 2 would be if the individual's mother or father was a teacher or a nurse. NSEC 3 would be more low-level office jobs. NSEC 4 is the self-employed. So, of course, we observe a lot of variation across this. This can mean many different things, but largely self-employed would be things like carpenters, electricians, taxi drivers, hairdressers, etc. And then NSEC 5, lower supervisory and technical. These are sort of semi-skilled jobs, and then we have semi-routine and routine. So NSEC 7, routine would be cleaners, labourers, etc. And then NSEC 8 is those whose mother or father never worked or long-term unemployed. So this is an analytical sample that it provides us. As I said previously, based on the sequence of these questions to derive the information on parental occupation, sometimes individuals can fall through the cracks essentially and don't have information on parental occupation. So for instance, some surveys ask information about the household composition, and then they ask to identify a main wage earner, and then they ask the occupation of the main wage earner. So this is essentially the third question in the series of questions. But if an individual wasn't living with their parents when they were younger or couldn't identify a household composition, let's say they were brought up in care, obviously an individual then does not answer the second or third question. They can't identify a main wage earner, and they can, of course, report parental occupation. So this is what this undefined social origin groups is. So previously, this is a group that's been often overlooked within the literature. So what I'm presenting today is chapter 3 of my thesis. Chapters 1 and 2 focused on, more specifically, undefined social origins, why, how these questions are derived, why individuals have undefined social origins, and specifically looking at the life outcomes of these groups and individuals. So that's why I'm keeping this group within the analysis as well. But previously, this has often been overlooked. So we can see that 12% come from NSEC 1 origins, 17 from NSEC 2. And then if we look at those from more working class origins, NSEC 6 and NSEC 7, the undefined origin groups is quite large. This is largely made up of those who come from single parent households, largely single parents being the mother and the mother not working. So quite a large group, but that's the reason why. So in the next slide, I just firstly want to present some of the observable characteristics in terms of education and labour market outcomes of the respondents based on their social class. So for the purposes of simplicity in the presentation, I use the NSEC 3 classification. So in the next slide, I lump NSEC 1 and NSEC 2 together, and these are labelled as professional origins. I lump NSEC 3 and NSEC 4 together. These are labelled as intermediate origins. And then I lump NSEC 5, 6, and 7 together, and these are labelled as routine origins. So although it's the NSEC 3 classification that I use in the next slide, of course, as I says, we also have this undefined social origin group. So I'm keeping them as a separate group, as previous chapters of my thesis has found that the life outcomes of this group is worse or overall less advantageous in comparison to all those from other NSEC groups. And this collapsing approach is well established within the literature. So we can see those from professional origins, or we might regard as those from upper class origins, those from intermediate origins, we might also regard them as lower middle class, and those from routine origins, which also are regarded as working class. So we can see that those from undefined origins are younger on average, more likely to be female. So if we look at educational attainment or educational outcomes, those from professional origins are more likely to stay on to school at a later age. Almost half report holding a degree, whereas this is as little as 13% for those from undefined origins. And then if we look at the opposite end of the education scale, only 2% of those from professional origins report having no qualifications, whereas this is almost 8 times as high for those from undefined origins. So next we consider the labour market outcomes of these 4 groups, and we can see that those from NSEC 1 origins, over 1/5 work in NSEC 1 jobs, and 37% work in NSEC 2 jobs. So those from professional origins, this is if their mother or father worked in an NSEC 1 or NSEC 2 job, we can see that almost 50% of them also go on later in life to also work in similar jobs to their parents. In terms of gross monthly pay, we can see a class gradient here, and the individuals from professional origins earn the highest, those from undefined origins earn the lowest. But as we can see from above, individuals from professional origins, they're more likely to hold a degree. So in general, overall, they have better educational outcomes, but they're also more likely to work in professional and managerial jobs, which generally pay more. So we consider gross monthly pay by degree and also gross monthly pay within these NSEC 1 and NSEC 2 jobs. So gross monthly pay by degree, again, we can see that those from professional origins report the highest returns to the degree. So even when individuals from routine origins and undefined origins still hold a degree, on average, they're reporting about £3,000 to £4,000 per annum less than those from professional origins. Next, we look at pay within professional and managerial origins, NSEC 1 and NSEC 2. And again, we can see that those from professional origins, even when they do hold a degree and do work in the same types of jobs as those from working class origins, they still earn more on average. But some of the other things that might be explaining this is that those from professional origins are more likely to work in a salaried occupation, they're more likely to hold managerial duties in their job, and they're more likely to work in larger firms, which generally, on average, pay more. So these might be also explaining why those from professional origins earn more. So next, the main contribution of the paper is looking at the role of cultural capital and social capital. So within understanding society, it asks individuals in waves 2 and 5 a list of cultural activities, and they're asked whether or not they have partake or engaged in these activities within the past 12 months. So quite an exhaustive list here. Not all of them would generally be regarded as, let's say, quote unquote, highbrow culture. So highbrow culture essentially means culture that is synonymous with the upper class life. So things like the opera, art galleries, museums, etc. These would generally be regarded as more upper class. There's things here like playing a musical instrument or reading for pleasure. And obviously, that's a bit more common across class backgrounds. So, but firstly, we just look at cultural engagement by respondents' social class background. So here lists the 20 activities and the percentage of engagement by respondents in relation to their social class background. So I've had to crop the image here as it was a bit difficult to try and fit in 9 columns into a latex table. But the grey boxes highlight the highest percentage of engagement by social class background, and the blue boxes highlight the lowest percentage of engagement. So here we can see across the board, almost like a class gradient across all activities, where those from professional origins, particularly those from NSEC 1, report the highest level of engagement in these cultural activities, and those from more working class and undefined origins report the lowest level of engagement in these activities. So next, I look at total cultural engagement. So based on the distribution of these values, like for the 20 activities, it's very unlikely that many individuals would engage in, let's say, 10 or more of the 20 cultural activities. Realistically, that's not going to happen. So based on the distribution of the values and responses, I then create a new variable to look at individuals, let's say, quote unquote, total cultural engagement. And this is split into those who engage in no cultural activities, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. So the dark blue box is individuals who engaged in no cultural activities. And as we can see, that is lowest for those from NSEC 1 origins. And it's somewhat of a class gradient, with an exception of between those from NSEC 4 and NSEC 5 origins. So those from professional managerial origins are the least likely to say that they didn't report in any of these cultural activities. The opposite end of the scale, the light blue box, considers individuals who have engaged in 4 or more of the activities. And we can see this is highest for those from NSEC 1 origins, followed by those from NSEC 2 origins. And again, a somewhat of a class gradient here, not quite the same as no cultural activities, but we can see that the highest is concentrated amongst those from working class origins. So whilst this is, informative to look at in terms of individual activities and total cultural engagement, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it might not necessarily be your total level of cultural engagement that is important in the labour market, and particularly within professional managerial firms, but it's your engagement within distinct cultural activities that signal your social status or your class position. So in the next slide, and this is what I focus on going forward, is a look at 7 of the 20 activities that we looked at previously that would generally be regarded as highbrow culture. So 6 of these 7 activities would generally be regarded as highbrow culture, such as the opera, galleries and museums, etc., ballet, classical music. The only one that wouldn't be regarded as highbrow culture is a member of a book club. So previously, we looked at reading for pleasure as a variable or as an activity, and this was highest, and there was a clear class gradient across all groups, where those from NSEC 1 origins, 80% said they read for pleasure, whereas the lowest was from those from undefined origins at 58%. And of course, there's a lot of reasons why a social class background could influence this, in terms of the number of books we're exposed to in a household during our youth and adolescence, the number of times that were read to as children, the number of words that we're exposed to on a daily basis, as well as it being correlated with educational attainment. So I also included a member of a book club here, also because it's a social activity. It's an activity where individuals can meet other people, and they can also meet other people who share similar interests and might also share similar levels of education, as opposed to reading for pleasure, which is an individual activity. So across the board, generally the 6 of the other 7 activities would be regarded as highbrow culture. And as we can see, those from professional origins much more likely to engage in these highbrow culture activities, and those from working class origins much less likely to engage. So nothing particularly groundbreaking there as such, but of course, if we're going to look at this in terms of modelling, we first need to look at the engagement in terms of descriptively by social class background. But we can see across most activities there is a class gradient, and we can see there is huge differences in some activities. Let's say, for instance, like opera, 7% of those from NSEC 1, whereas less than 2% from those working class origins report attending the opera within the past 12 months. So next, we look at social capital, and we measure this by 3 variables essentially. Well, we could say 5, and it looks at how respondents met their best friends. So this is, for whatever reason, in understanding society, it asks how respondents met their three best friends, and then it also asks the employment status of the three best friends. It then also asks questions regarding the proportion of friends who have similar education, employment, and income. So the first two look at their three best friends, and then the next three questions look at proportion of friends more generally. So this gives us more of an indication and an insight into individuals' broader social networks. So firstly, considering how respondents met their best friends. So as we can see, it's quite an exhaustive list here, whether or not they met them through family, work, college, etc. But in the next slide, I just look at 4 possible ways that respondents met their best friends, as arguably these are, class related and might play a role within the workplace. So firstly, looking at whether or not respondents met their best friends in the neighbourhood. So again, the blue boxes highlight the lowest percentage and the grey boxes highlight the highest percentage by respondents' social class background. So we can see that for three best friends, those from working class and undefined social origins are most likely to say that they've met their friends in the neighbourhood, whereas those from professional origins are least likely, but there is an exception in that for their third best friend, this is the lowest. But generally across the board, those from more working class origins are more likely to met their best friends in the neighbourhood. Secondly, considering that they form these. So I'm just double checking everyone can still hear me okay. I got a notification there saying my internet was unstable.
Yeah, Michael, you were breaking up a bit. You might want to turn your camera off and just focus on audio.
Okay, no worries, don't it out. Okay, I've turned my camera off, hopefully that will help. But if not, if it breaks up again, please just let me know.
Yeah, well done.
So in terms of at school, so again, we can see that those from NSEC 5 to undefined origins, which those from undefined origins are most similar to those from working class origins. We might think of these as like a subsection of the working class, but again, they're most likely to have met their best friends at school. So the results of the first two engagements of how they met their friends might indicate two things. It might indicate that working class ties and connections are perhaps stronger in the sense that they form either in the neighbourhood or at school and they hold into adulthood. But it also might indicate a lack of mobility and that these relationships are formed at a young age. And new relationships are much less likely to be formed because people don't move away for college or university, or they don't move away for work. They tend to stay in the area that they were reared in. When we look at those who form relationships in terms of college and university, we can see that those from professional origins are much more likely to have met their best friends at college or university, whereas this is least likely for those from NSEC 5, NSEC 6 and NSEC 7. So again, those from working class origins. So this indicates overall that those from professional origins are more likely to have networks which hold similar levels of education. And as we can see from previous slides, those from professional origins, 46% hold a degree. So this indicates that overall, their networks are more likely to hold similar levels of education as well. Lastly, in terms of an organisation or activity, so this might include some of the activities that we've previously looked at in terms of the cultural activities. Though it might be something more political as well. Those from professional origins are most likely to have met their friends via an organisation or activity, and those from working class origins are less likely. So not definitely, but again, this might indicate that those from professional origins, they're more likely to have networks and friendships which display possibly high levels of cultural capital. So next we consider the employment status of respondents' three best friends. And here we can see quite somewhat of a class gradient in that those from NSEC 1 origins are most likely to report that their best friends are unemployment. So this is what the grey box indicates. And those from undefined origins, the blue box, are least likely to indicate or report that their best friends are unemployment. Conversely, looking at it from the other way, we can see that the opposite results hold, and that those from NSEC 1 origins are least likely to report that their best friends are unemployed, and those from undefined origins are most likely to report that their best friends are unemployed. So, of course, as we know, within the labour market, information is a huge thing, which helps individuals get jobs, helps individuals find the jobs, can help people within the workplace as well. This could be beneficial in terms of job matching, helping individuals with application forms, CVs, etc. So, of course, we can see here that across the board, those from professional origins are more likely to have networks that might be more educated, might have more levels of cultural capital, and also might be in more advantageous positions to help them within the labour market in terms of job matching, etc. So perhaps not quite as clear as the proportion of friends who have similar education and income. So quite mixed results here, and it's not quite as conclusive as previous slides. But I think an important thing to note is those from NSEC 1 origins, as I say, is almost half report, or those from professional origins, NSEC 1 and NSEC 2. So those from NSEC 1 origins, it's actually slightly higher than half have a degree. So we can see that almost 30% report holding similar levels of education, and then 43% say that more than half of their friends also have similar education. So we can see that about almost 3/4 of their friends from those from NSEC 1 either say that friends have similar levels of education, or more than half of their friends have similar education. Regarding income levels, we can see that, again, this is quite mixed across social class background, but we can see that for those, more than half, over a third of those from NSEC 1 origins report that the friends have, the proportion of their friends, more than half, have similar levels of income. Whereas you can see this is sort of all similar income is higher from those from working class origins. And as we looked at previously, in terms of their gross monthly pay, but also their pay in regards to their return to the degree and their pay within professional jobs, this is lowest. So again, this might indicate that those from working class origins also have networks that hold similarly low levels of income. So there's a lot of different ways that we might dissect this table. It's not quite as clear cut. There isn't really as quite as clear as a class gradient in terms of what we've seen previously. But we also know that people form relationships which are also based on like homophily, so based on similar social cultural interests, but generally people also form relations based on friends who have similar education and income as well. So next, the empirical approach. So in this paper, I use the random effects model, which looks at the log of gross monthly pay as a dependent variable, as it's monthly pay that's reported in understanding society and not hourly pay. We use social origin dummies, which, as I've said previously, is proxied via the highest parental occupation when the respondent was 14. We control for age and age squared. Sorry, and then we have a base specification which controls for demographics such as sex, ethnicity, disability, region, and of course the year of the study. And then we control for the highest level of education of the respondent. And then we also control for a number of different labour market observables. So we control for work sector, whether or not the respondent works in a permanent or a temporary job, the firm size they work at, whether or not they hold managerial duties in their job, and their occupational status. So occupational status is the NSEC classification, which is the same classification which is used to proxy for social origin. So NSEC 1, NSEC 2, etc. So basically, this is the previous model or approach that has been used in the class pay gap literature. So I just show this as model 1 as a base specification, rather than going through all the results and all the different coefficients. So that is a base specification. In model 2, we take the base specification and we also control for cultural capital only, not social capital. In model 3, we take the base specification and we control for only social capital. And then in model 4, we control for cultural and social capital. So the reason I've done this is essentially it's almost like a data exercise, if you like, is to look at the effects of cultural capital and social capital in isolation. But as we know, our cultural capital and our social capital, our cultural interests and our networks, they don't exist in isolation. These are often intertwined, and sometimes or often our cultural tastes can influence our networks, and vice versa. Our networks can also influence our cultural tastes. So the main model, or the final model, if you like, is model 4, which controls for cultural and social capital. Look at these specific types of capital in isolation first to try and see if there was any differences or are they actually explaining the pay gap. So here we have a coefficient plot of the results. So NSEC 1 origins is the reference category. So this is individual mother or father who was, let's say, a lawyer or a doctor, etc. And you can see here, firstly, that all groups, apart from those from NSEC 2 origins, report significant pay gaps. So firstly, that's an important finding in and of itself, because the social origin pay gap hasn't been analysed using this data set. And as I said, it's a longitudinal data set following individuals over a 10-year period, and we're working with a large sample size here. So that's an important finding in and of itself. So firstly, if we consider the blue dots, this is the base specification that controls for demographics, educational attainment, and respondents' labour market observables. The next, the red line or the red dot, looks at controlling for cultural capital. And quite interestingly, we can see that cultural capital isn't actually explaining the social origin pay gap. If anything, it's actually moving in the opposite direction from what we might anticipate. But as I said previously, we know cultural capital and social capital don't exist in isolation. This was sort of more of an exercise, if you like, to see cultural capital and social capital in isolation. So the green dot or the green line looks at the base specification plus social capital. And as we can see that across all social origin groups, this is actually explaining the social origin pay gap, more so for those from more working class origins. And the largest variance or the largest explanatory power that social capital has is for those from undefined origins. So we have the base specification. The red line looks at controlling for cultural capital, and the green line looks at controlling for social capital. In the orange line, we also control for cultural and social capital. So as we can see, that once we take both of these forms of capital into account, they are explaining the social origin pay gap. And again, like not a huge amount, but quite interestingly, when we control for cultural capital on its own, it's not explaining the pay gap. When we control for social capital, it is explaining the pay gap. But when we control for cultural and social capital, it's further explaining the pay gap. And these are just the figures, the coefficients and standard errors to support the coefficient plot, previous slide. So the model 1, we can see that there's pay gaps of around almost 9% from those from NSEC 7 and undefined origins. Surprisingly, it's largest for those from NSEC 4 origins. This is those whose mother or father was self-employed. But those from ethnic backgrounds are disproportionately represented within NSEC 4 origins. So further work, I'm trying to dissect this a bit more, and to what extent is this actually capturing potentially an ethnicity pay gap. So if we look at model 4, which controls for cultural and social capital, the final model, if you like, we can see that we see pay gaps of around ranging from 5.7% up to almost 9%, significant at the 1% level for those from NSEC 4 origins through to undefined origins. and the pay gap is only not significant for those from NSEC 2 origins. So this is individuals from lower managerial and professional jobs, which we might expect given that there's a lot of similarities between those from NSEC 1 and NSEC 2 origins, and that their mothers and fathers might work in different jobs, but generally they still work in high occupations, they're still most likely to hold a degree, and they're still more likely to have high levels of income. So discussion. So as I says that we find that the social origin pay gap marginally increases once we control for cultural engagement, but actually social capital is explaining the unexplained pay gap. So this might represent the impact of unequal access to social capital, which the descriptive statistics have given us an insight as to what that might look like. Interestingly, when we control for both forms of capital, we observe that this further explains the pay gap. So this highlights the importance of taking into account both pay gaps, and that there might be an interaction effect, and that these forms of capital amplify and complement one another. And this is what sort of I'm trying to work on within the paper as to how I might explain this. So Lizardo 2006, for instance, looks at the difference between strong ties and weak ties in terms of how cultural interests influence our networks and vice versa. And the term like strong ties is essentially like a proxy for if you engage in these very distinct cultural activities like the opera, ballet, art galleries, museums, etc. Obviously, not a huge amount of people engage in these activities. So individuals who do, they're quite a clear indication of their class position or their class status. So when individuals do engage in these activities, the relationships that are formed in these we generally regard as more of a strong tie and could prove more beneficial in the labour market. And a lot of the qualitative literature shows this within professional jobs, whereas weak activities, which are generally more popular. So individuals who engage in more popular activities, of course, that's a lot more common. So the connections that are made there might not necessarily be as beneficial. But of course, there's a number of limitations to this study. The main one being that the effects of cultural capital on wages are difficult to disentangle. So I'm not arguing for a second that if you go to the opera, you will get paid more. It's not, of course, it's quite as simple and clear cut as that. But this paper was trying to empirically or quantitatively try and, as best as possible with the data set, try and get at the systems and processes through which these pay gaps arise and are perpetuated. And as I say, a lot of the qualitative literature shows that cultural capital and social capital is clearly playing a role here, but no study has quantitatively tested that yet. But obviously, that's a very difficult thing to do based on it's highly correlated with educational attainment. So I presented at UCL a couple of weeks back, and someone made a very good suggestion in that it might actually be the way the model is set up, and that cultural capital is at the end, after education, after labour market observables. So it's actually trying to pick up something which most of the variance has already been explained. So I might have to reconsider the setup of the model, which actually might increase the explanatory power of cultural capital. But in terms of the survey, in terms of how these questions are asked, as I say, is that individuals are asked whether or not they engage in these activities in the past 12 months, but it is only a binary response whether or not the individual mentioned or not mentioned engaging in these activities. So therefore, it doesn't measure the volume or frequency of the engagement, which obviously would be very useful to know, as we don't know if these engagements attend the opera on a monthly basis. If they do so, that's of course a clear indication of a more high class position, but also that their engagement in that activity wasn't by chance. So it'd be good to know the volume or frequency, and we'd be able to unpack whether or not individuals attended based on, was it a work event? Did someone get them a ticket, or did they voluntarily go? Some cultural activities as well are contingent on income, such as attending the opera, in terms of money for dressing appropriately, the ticket, spending money, etc. And also a lot of these cultural activities, maybe not so much the highbrow cultural activities, but the extensive list of cultural activities are very much art-based as well. And within the UK, in the past 10 years or so, we have seen large cuts to public funding in the arts. In terms of the social capital, whilst nonetheless insightful to get an insight of respondents' social networks in terms of how they were formed, their employment status, and the proportion of friends who have similar education and income, we can see that it's the employment status of respondents' best friends and friends, which is the only social capital variable which is significant. So further work or further studies, it would be more insightful or more useful to know actually the occupational status of their friends. So not necessarily the employment status, but what types of jobs their friends work in, and whether or not working in, of course, more professional jobs, does that prove more beneficial. Also, although the proportion of friends of education wasn't significant, obtaining information on the qualifications and education levels of friends would also be more beneficial as well. So in conclusion, we find that individuals from upper class origins are significantly more likely to engage in distinct highbrow cultural activities, and across the board, it paints a very clear picture that they are more likely to have what we regard as, let's say, advantageous social networks, which can prove very beneficial in the labour market. We observe significant pay gaps for all social origin groups, except those from NSEC 2 origins, so those whose mother or father worked in a lower managerial or professional job, after controlling for the demographics, education, and labour market observables. So again, an important finding to highlight, firstly, as the social origin pay gap previously hasn't been explored using this data set. So we find that cultural capital isn't actually explaining the social origin pay gap on its own, but with control for social capital on its own, it does explain the pay gap. So this might indicate that this is explained by unequal access to social networks. But when we consider both forms of capital together, we can see that actually the pay gap is further reduced in comparison to when we only control for social capital in and of itself. So this suggests that both forms of capital, they may complement each other, and therefore consideration of both cultural and social capital has to be given in how we think about explaining the social origin pay gap. So thank you very much for listening, folks. Any feedback would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. That was a fascinating and even better on the second go round. And
Thank you.
the people are going to put